Thank you very much. I'm very conscious of the fact that I am all that stands between you and dinner. So I'm not going to be overly lengthy. I do want to begin by saying, though, that I was very moved by the tribute that was paid last night on September 11th. And I'm going to begin by telling you my own story on September 11th. I was the Assistant Attorney General in charge of the Criminal Division at the Department of Justice on that day. I had been in office for about 3 months. And back in 2001, there was no Department of Homeland Security. So the responsibility for dealing with any domestic act of terrorism fell on the Department of Justice. It was a new administration under President Bush. There were very few confirmed people in place. And as I drove in on what was a remarkably sunny and temperate morning, I was on one of those old car phones, and I was talking to my deputy. And he had the TV on, and he said, a plane just crashed into the World Trade Center. And like many people, I assumed it was a private pilot who had gotten somehow confused. And as I approached the office, he said to me, another plane just hit the World Trade Center. And we both realized we were at war. I arrived, he and I went over to the FBI where the operations center was, and I met Bob Mueller, who was at that point 8 days into his new tenure as the FBI director. And what we did for the next 24, 48 hours and weeks was, first of all, to determine what happened. Second, and more important, to make sure it didn't happen again. And third, to begin to build the architecture for what would be a transformation of American society in a brand new threat environment. I can tell you during that day, I watched something I never believed I would see in real life, which is the order being given over a secure video conference to shoot down the fourth plane that was headed towards Washington. And a less well-known fact was that there were false alarms that day. We did a secure call with the State Department, and in the middle of the call there was a fire alarm, and we thought a bomb had gone off. It was a false alarm. There was another plane that had a transponder indicating a hijacking that was coming in from the Pacific. And it took a couple of hours to resolve the fact that that was actually just an error. And there was even a rumor that there were taxi drivers all over Washington who had bombs in their cabs, and they were going to be driving up to public buildings and blowing them up. And I say this not just to dramatize what that day was like, but to remind everybody of the fact that we did not know whether what we had experienced was the worst terrorist attack in American history or just the precursor to worst terrorist attack. And, you know, looking backwards is 2020. We were looking forward, and I think we're still very much in that position. I will say one thing strikes me very much about the period right after September 11th, and that is the fact that we were poised at a moment when the American public could really have panicked, because we'd never experienced an attack like this in the lifetime of anybody. And even Pearl Harbor, although it was an attack on the United States, occurred in Hawaii and was really focused on a military base. It was not an attack on civilians. And the issue was, how do you balance between demonstrating to the American public that you are absolutely committed to bring justice one way or the other to the terrorists and to make sure it doesn't happen again, and yet at the same time not to create a climate of overreaction. And I'm happy to say, maybe not everyone will agree, that I thought President Bush hit the note exactly. He made it implacably clear that there was no gray zone here. You were with us or against us. You either were a companion against terrorism or you were an enabler of terrorism. And the very next day, NATO invoked for the first time Article 5 under the Charter to show that they viewed this as an act of war and they were standing with us. Yet at the same time, the president, within a couple of days, went to a mosque and made it clear this was not a war with Islam or all Muslims. It was a war with a particular ideological outgrowth of extreme violent jihadism, and that we were going to focus on that ideology, but we were not going to confuse that with being at war with the entire Islamic world. I think that actually that is maybe the greatest challenge to terrorism back then and today. It is the fact that you must inspire confidence in the people that you take the job and the responsibility seriously. At the same time, you don't want to panic them or suggest that we're in an atmosphere of hysteria. So as we stepped back and we began to think more strategically about how we were going to deal with terrorism, and I consider this terrorism 1.0, it was the first manifestation of what would be over a decade of contending with violent jihadism. We recognized we were dealing largely with a group of people who had come from overseas. They had planned and trained from overseas. They had financed from overseas. They had built a very elaborate plan, which had been constructed over a period of months, if not years. Actually, it had its roots in a failed plot in the mid-1990s to blow up airliners that were in the Pacific. And we recognized we had to build a new architecture of security that dealt with that particular type of threat. We understood that we were dealing with terrorists who were operating on a top-down, relatively hierarchical, almost micromanagerial approach to terrorism. And that gave us a little bit of an advantage. It meant that they would have to communicate, they would have to move money, they would have to travel. And in each of those elements of preparation and planning, there'd be a vulnerability if we built the right intelligence apparatus to collect, analyze, and share what was going on. We also recognized that they were very much fixated on the big event. What bin Laden wanted was things that were viewed as large-scale attacks with dramatic impact. But that meant it took time. It meant it was complicated. There were a lot of moving parts. And again, those created vulnerabilities which we could exploit in order to detect and unravel plots. And so we built an architecture against that kind of threat, understandably, because the scale of 9/11 was far beyond anything we'd experienced in smaller terrorist attacks over the years. And that scale began by focusing overseas, recognizing that although the borders were at the Atlantic and Pacific and Mexico and Canada, the real entry begins way on the other side of the world. That focus meant we were concerned about intelligence. We went into Afghanistan to disrupt laboratories and training sites. It also meant we built a very comprehensive and intelligence-driven system to control who enters the country and to vet the people who enter, again, because that was the operational approach we were most concerned about. Finally, we worked very hard to reduce the vulnerabilities of our critical infrastructure. Air, obviously, most because of what we had experienced, but also other parts of the fixed infrastructure and other parts of transportation mode. All of these were elements of what has been a very successful approach to dealing with externally imported terrorism, where the operatives actually come from overseas. And we've had extremely few instances, none during my tenure at Homeland Security, where there was a successful attack arising from somebody who came as a visitor into the United States. But now we're in a different place. We're in what I call terrorism, not just 1.0, which remains a concern, but 2.0 and 3.0. What do I mean by 2.0? 2.0 is the terrorism that recognizes that you may not be able to pull off the big event, but if you pull off a number of small events, you can also have a significant impact. A poster child for this is Mumbai, 2008. It's a plot that involved a small group of people coming ashore on a boat, and then they spend 60 hours going from place to place with bombs and guns, terrorizing the city of Mumbai. And that, while not of the scale of a 9/11, certainly had a dramatic impact on the city and on the country of India. Paris, more recently, was an example of this, the attack on the club and on the stadium. Again, a small, coordinated group, not 1,000 casualties or 2,000, but a persistent, ongoing, relatively well-planned attack that does shake people up. And you can see the impact of this in the drop in tourism that some European countries are experiencing. At the same time, even more recently, we've seen 3.0. And what 3.0 is what some describe as inspired or influenced terrorism. This is looking to people who are not going to be able to be directly trained or recruited face-to-face, who may not be directed or operationally assisted or helped with planning by people in the central terrorist organization, but are going to be inspired to pick up whatever is to hand, gun, knife, homemade bomb in your mother's kitchen, or an automobile, and go out and just randomly kill. These attacks are not going to be at the scale even of a Mumbai style attack. But what they do prey upon is the uncertainty and fear the public has that at any moment somebody can come up and stab or shoot or run them over in the interests of terror. And I know people in Israel are well acquainted with this form of terrorism. So how do we take the architecture for 1.0 terrorism and now add to it architectures for 2.0 and 3.0? Well, first we have to recognize some of the critical differences between what I call 1.0 and these later manifestations of terrorism. One thing I think we've learned is, and this is particularly true with the Mumbai-style and Paris-style attack, the line between ideological terrorism and criminality turns out not to be a very clear line when you're dealing with these kinds of operatives and operational actors. These are not people who've been radicalized for the most part over a long period of time and then graduate to the point that they want to become operational. These are people who a week before were at the strip club drinking whiskey, probably wouldn't really have much of a sense of what the rules of Islam are, and a week later they're ready to pick up guns and do something. Many of them are petty criminals known to the police. They are people who've operated at the margins of society, and in some ways joining this effort is a little bit like criminals who join gangs because it's the biggest, baddest criminal activity around. But what that means is, and that has some implications about the way we collect and analyze intelligence. A second feature of 2.0 and 3.0 is what I call a low signature. There's not going to be a lot of communication. There's not going to be international travel or movement of money. If you look, for example, at San Bernardino, you had a husband and a wife. They don't have to communicate over the internet. They can communicate in the privacy of their own home or apartment. That means there's less for us to capture using traditional signals and high-tech intelligence. There's also, as somebody said earlier, a short distance from flash to bang. They're going to decide they want to do something, and because these are, at least in the case of 3.0, not particularly well-developed plans, it's not going to be a very long window for us to discover that. So again, that affects the way in which we think about collection and operationalizing our response. Third, there are going to be a lot more targets. Our effort to identify critical infrastructure, which we put into place after 9/11, is not going to work when everything is a target. Shopping centers, movie theaters, walking down the street, everything is a place where there can be a target. You simply cannot turn all of those into a version of airport security. So that means you have to think about how do you deal with terrorism in that kind of open space environment. Fourth, although the consequences of these kinds of attacks are going to be much less, the demoralizing effect we've seen recently can actually be greater than a 9/11. And that comes back to the point I made earlier. It's not the scale or the number of people killed. It turns out that it matters a lot about the frequency and the question about whether the government has an adequate response and is taking control of the situation. One thing I will tell you that I learned over my 4 years at Homeland Security, smothering the zone and flooding the zone, whether it's a terrorist attack like 9/11 or a natural disaster, is a critical element in reassuring the public and regaining their trust. If you don't do that, over a period of time you discover that you have an erosion of trust. And then people start to look for some pretty radical solutions. And that has, as former Minister Livni said, has some implications for democracy and for society. So without overdoing it, having a firm, strong response is important in dealing with the demoralizing effect of this metastasis of terrorism 2.0 and 3.0. So what are my suggestions then for how do we respond to this? And I don't have, a complete answer, but I have some things that I think are important to think about. First, I think the way we think about intelligence has to broaden to include not just spies and satellites, but bottom-up community intelligence, community-based policing, the cops who interact with the petty criminals, the people in schools, the community leaders, many of whom might, if they were properly trained, have some insight that somebody is perhaps moving in a dangerous direction. Those people have to be generating the kind of information and then it has to be integrated and collected so we can get a picture of what might be bubbling on the street. We do this in the U.S. through our fusion centers, but candidly, more and more, I think we need to push this effort down to training police, other government officials, teachers, and community leaders all over the country. Second is we need to recognize that there's going to have to be more and better information sharing globally. And I'm going to be pretty candid here. Over the years I was in office, and since then, there have been issues sometimes with certain countries in Europe that don't want to share information. We struggled for years about passenger name record information or other information about people who've even been convicted of crimes, but privacy laws mean that some governments don't want to share those with the United States. I can tell you that if there are seams in our information sharing about people, that is exactly where you're going to find the terrorists finding themselves. And while we can't be perfect in collecting all the information, it would be a shame if we had information that was relevant and we can't share it. A project I'm working on now, for example, in Europe involves trying to come up with platforms that would allow greater multilateral sharing of information while respecting the fact that there still are some differences in laws and concerns about safeguarding sources and methods. But we've got to get that right. And that's particularly true if, as was said earlier today, we start to see foreign fighters returning, because they have trained over there. Some of them are going to be quite incentivized to carry out attacks. And speaking as an American, they may come back initially to Europe, but some of them are going to want to try to come to the U.S. And with our visa waiver program with many European countries, we're not going to have the same ability to screen as we do with visas. And that means we're going to rely more and more on getting an early heads up from our European partners. And I want to stress, for those of us who believe as I do, this is a very important travel program that we can move back and forth freely between our countries. I would not want to see it jeopardized because we're not sharing information about known threats. Third, we're going to need to look at some of the architecture that we put into place for 1.0 and maybe revisit. And I'll give you an example. If you look at the way we designed airport security, we did it with the idea of a secure envelope. That is focused on protecting the airplane, first and foremost from a hijacking, and secondly from a bomb. Now, the hijacking threat has been reduced, although not eliminated, by having secure protocols with respect to cockpit doors, provided that those are honored and actually followed. And the bombing issue, of course, has become more complicated as we move away from metallic-based bombs into liquid and other kind of chemical bombs. But one of the things we didn't do is design a system that deals with the area right outside the security envelope. Now, I know Israel is very good at this. I'm not going to reveal things I was shown in confidence. But I can tell you in the US and in Europe, often we have created with the screening architecture literally a target-rich environment for people with guns and bombs. They may not get on the plane, but they're going to get all the people waiting to get through security. And I think now, having spoken to the head of TSA, there's a real focus now on dealing with the airports and getting them to think through this problem. We need to reduce that vulnerability, and that means challenging some of the assumptions about the architecture, the physical architecture of our public areas that have been built upon a model of keeping everybody penned up until they can get through security. Likewise, what I call information-based whitelisting has to become a better tool. We need to be able to screen people based on their conduct, not just based upon what they have in their bag. But a lot of the watch listing that is currently done is built upon, is somebody known to be a terrorist? Do we have some kind of a criminal record or something of that sort? As we've looked at some of the people who've become self-radicalized, it's not often going to be the case they're going to have a record. They're going to be what we call clean skins. But you will notice something interesting. If you look at their behavior at large, their credit card history, where do they go to restaurants, what are they doing with their day, how much communication are they having with people, you will often see right at the point of radicalization an abrupt change in behavior. Now, maybe sometimes people have abrupt changes for other reasons, but it does suggest that we could start to whitelist people. We could say, if you are willing to share with us information about, which we'll keep confidential, about your transactions, banking, stuff of that sort. Not the details, but just the patterns. We will whitelist you. We will put you in a preferred line where you can move through with less screening or maybe no screening. And then with that permission, it's not an invasion of privacy to begin to run behavioral analysis against that to see whether there's been a change of behavior. So we're going to have to look at that too. Finally, under this heading of how do we change the architecture, we need to recognize, and I think Minister Bennett said it earlier, response becomes as important, if not more important, as prevention. You can't stop someone from walking with a knife or a gun on a street, but if you can shut them down quickly, that makes a big difference. One of the challenges that I think Mumbai presented was it took them 60 hours to get the commandos in place. An event that occurs over 60 hours is going to have a much more traumatic impact than one that occurs in 6 hours or 60 minutes or 15 minutes. So that response time becomes critical. Finally, the last element of what I would say is a strategy against 2.0 and 3.0 has to do with how do we de-radicalize or change people's path to radicalization, particularly given the short period from flash to bang. Part of this is maybe a longer conversation about what some people call countering violent extremism. And it involves whether you can create off-ramps, things that can intervene so that when someone is beginning to be perceived as getting radicalized, you can somehow take them away or lure them away from that path. That's going to require, in the most cases, family members or close friends to raise their hand. And here I have to say, at least in the US, we have a problem. Because the mechanism we principally use when someone raises their hand is we investigate and arrest the individual. And a lot of parents and friends are going to be reluctant to raise their hand if it means that their loved one is going to wind up in jail. But if you can give them an avenue that might de-radicalize or turn them away or divert them or even put them on probation, before you get to the point of getting to jail, you might get some more hands raised. More generally, I do think we have to have a candid conversation. Again, as I said, President Bush did at the very beginning after 9/11. We need to recognize that there is an ideology here that is either directing, instigating, or at least influencing a certain kind of ideologically driven terror. While it is not all of Islam and it's not most Muslims, it does claim and does purport to speak for Islam, and it does cherry pick elements of Islamic doctrine, often presented to people who have no clue really what the Quran says. And it's used as a way of wrapping the urge to violence in what appears to be a heroic narrative. And for a lot of these folks, they want to be heroes in their own life story. I mean, there's a story, I don't want to give anything confidential away, but one particular terrorist attack, the terrorist was busy spending time uploading pictures of himself onto social media. Happily, he wasn't killing people during those moments. But that mentality means we need to identify and speak to what this ideology is. I will have to say in this respect, there is a role for dealing with social media. On the other hand, I would caution against too broadly defining incitement so that it becomes a tool or a vehicle to suppress people who simply disagree or have perhaps even a view that we find distasteful politically, but that does not rise to the level of incitement. I can tell you, having worked on a big internet governance project over the last 2 years, if you go to Russia and China, there are plenty of people who are licking their chops at being told, yeah, go out and suppress on the internet ideas that you consider to be threatening, because a whole bunch of people working in civil society will find themselves shut down. So again, this is a tool to be used appropriately but with care. Finally, in the last couple of minutes, I want to talk about what we may be seeing as what I would describe as 4.0, and that is where the internet not only becomes an issue for persuasion and recruitment, but it becomes an operational tool. Obviously, we have seen instances in the past where people have used internet to gain access to industrial control systems and try to break them or at least disrupt them. Classic example is 2012, the attack by what we believe to be Iranian sympathizers against Saudi Aramco, destroying the data and the systems of 20 or 30,000 machines. We may see more of this. And as the Internet of Things, where everything is connected wirelessly, expands, we are creating a larger and larger attack surface for terrorists. And we need to be thinking about that as we design the architecture of these devices. Finally, even a more recent example I learned about just at a public forum I participated in last week in Washington. There was a case the FBI brought recently against two activists who were ISIS sympathizers. One of them hacked into the personal data sets of individual officials and public figures, and then getting things like, addresses and things of that sort and email information. It was then sent out to other people with the instruction, here's where this person lives, here's something about what their course of behavior is, go kill them. The idea of using the Internet to target individuals for assassination is something I'm afraid we haven't seen the last of, even though these two are in prison. And that means we're also going to have to start to educate ourselves and our families about operational security on the Internet. You do not want to advertise all the details of your itinerary necessarily on Facebook. And that's going to be something even people who plan conferences are going to have to be sensitive about. So we're entering a world in which, on the one hand, the good news is we've done a lot to reduce the risk of a 1.0, although I caution it's far from eliminated, but we're dealing with a lot more 2.0 and 3.0. And as former Minister Livni said, the real risk is that our societies, if we don't take a firm but measured approach to dealing with 2.0 and 3.0, we may find society beginning to erode and our values beginning to erode that would actually give the terrorists the victory that they seriously want but do not deserve. Thank you very much, and thank you for your good work.